studying today, I'll be reading the New Testament of the Bible, and it's going to be Epoch 9. Epoch 1 is Egypt's first dynasties. Epoch 2, dating Abraham from the Exodus. Epoch 3, Egypt and the New Kingdom. Epoch 4, the cycles of the judges. Epoch 5, Rehoboam and Jeroboam divide the kingdom. Epoch 6, dates in the book of Ezekiel. Epoch 7, the 70 years of Jeremiah. Epoch 8, Luke and the career of Quirinius. And Epoch 9 is evidence for dating New Testament events. And I'll be starting Epoch 8, the coming of the Messiah. This is 37 BC through AD 30. The epoch that witnessed the Messiah's coming actually began with the rise to power of King Herod the Great. The lives of Herod and his sons were closely connected with the earthly life of the Messiah, Jesus of Nazareth. According to the Gospel of Matthew, Herod the Great ordered the deaths of all male children in Bethlehem who were under the age of 2. An order that forced Joseph to flee, taking his wife and young child to Egypt. After Herod's death, his sons continued to impact the life of the Messiah. One of Herod's sons was partly responsible for the Messiah becoming known as Jesus of Nazareth. When Joseph returned from Egypt with Mary and Jesus, he chose to avoid Judea. Herod's son, Archelaus, ruled over Judea and was worse than his father. So Joseph, with Jesus, settled in Nazareth of Galilee. Herod Antipas, another son of Herod the Great, ordered the death of John the Baptist and held a mock hearing of Jesus after his arrest. Despite having positions of power, the Herodian family was overshadowed by the great events that occurred during their time, the ministry, crucifixion, and resurrection of the Messiah, bringing victory over sin, death, and the devil. Archaeology and the past. Archaeological discoveries in the Holy Land from the Roman period fall into two categories: those which shed light on the Roman world and those which shed light on the life of Jesus. Sometimes the same archaeological find fits into both categories. The Roman period, archaeologically, is the world of Herod the Great. Among his many building accomplishments is the great seaport Caesarea Maritima. Excavations have uncovered the theater, the harbor, vast warehouses, temples, and one important inscription, a stone bearing the name of Pontius Pilate, the governor, reminds us that Caesarea was also the headquarters of Roman forces occupying the land. Military installations were placed all over Judea, since it was a border province. Roman Jericho, built on a site different from both Old Testament Jericho and the modern city, was also the work of Herod. The ruins of a magnificent palace and baths have been uncovered in Jericho's excavations. In Jerusalem are more remains of Herod's building programs. The Wailing Wall is actually part of the great retaining wall Herod built around the Temple Mount to make a surface large enough for the temple rebuilding project. On the western side of the oldest city, at a site called the Tower of David, are the remains of one of the towers Herod built to defend the city. It is probably the tower called Phasael, as described by Josephus. Either in one of these towers or in his great palace nearby, Herod and his soldiers mocked Jesus. The ministry of Jesus is illumined by archaeology. In Galilee, the famous Jesus boat was discovered in a lake during a drought. One can picture Jesus, Peter, and the others setting out across the lake in such a boat, since it is much like the ones used by fishermen of the first century. In Capernaum, the center of Jesus' Galilean ministry, are at least two possible links to Jesus. The synagogue that visitors see is dated to the 4th century, but more recent excavations have shown the foundations of a 1st century building underneath it. Since synagogues were always built on the same site, the 1st century synagogue may have been where Jesus preached. Nearby are the ruins of an octagonal church. Archaeologists believe that this ancient church is on the site of Peter's house, and that the foundations discovered underneath the church are literally the remains of the building where Jesus stayed while in Capernaum. Around Jerusalem are many reminders of Jesus' ministry. Just over the Mount of Olives is the village of Bethany, where we find a 1st century tomb belonging to a wealthy family. This is the traditional tomb of Lazarus, having a vestibule chamber and a small inner chamber. Somewhere on the Mount of Olives is the Garden of Gethsemane, whether it was located at the Church of All Nations or nearby at the tomb of Mary is debated. But beyond debate is the reality that Jesus prayed in this vicinity. Excavations at the southern end of the Temple Mount have uncovered the steps that led up to the temple. Several steps remain in an unrestored condition and represent the way the 1st century persons, including Jesus, usually enter the temple. The steps are also identified as the rabbi's teaching steps, meaning that Jesus likely sat on them, teaching his disciples and the crowds. On the north end of the old city are twin pools which possibly represent the pool of Bethesda, where Jesus healed a lame man. The porches mentioned in John's Gospel stood along the sides of the pools and on the causeway between them. Back on the south end of the city are the remains of the Essene Gate, a 1st century gate that led into Jerusalem. Nearby the gate are the remains of the house of Caiaphas, who was high priest at the time of Jesus' trial. A dank, cold basement cell reminds us that Jesus may have been imprisoned there for at least a few hours. A paved courtyard above reminds us of Peter's denial by the high priest's house. One of the most powerful archaeological remains is the discovery of a man who had been crucified. Yohanan, the name inscribed in the stone box that held his bones, had nail marks in his wrists, and one nail driven through the heel bones. The wood of the cross had been cut apart and buried with him. Yohanan's bones illustrate crucifixion, a common method of execution for the Romans, and possibly suggest the way Jesus himself was executed. Archaeologists almost universally agree that the site of Jesus' tomb is located inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. At 2 points in the church, one can actually see what is left of the hill of Calvary. The traditional site of Jesus' burial is found very near other 1st century tombs. The peoples and groups. Peoples outside Judea and Galilee were also prominent in this period. The Nabateans were an Arabic people, with their capital at Petra to the south. The daughter of the Nabatean king Aretas IV married Herod Antipas. When Antipas threw head over his own sister-in-law Herodias, war broke out between Herod Antipas and the Nabateans. This was the same Herod who beheaded John the Baptist and held a hearing for Jesus at the request of Pilate. Southeast of the Sea of Galilee were the cities of the Decapolis, founded by Greeks and Macedonians. The Decapolis was united not by political organization, but by Hellenistic culture and institutions. Gerasa has been excavated, and one can see the city walls, the temples, the marketplace, and paved streets with the colonnades. The only remains of 1st century Philadelphia are the ruins of a Roman theater near the downtown heart of a bustling modern city. The Gospels mention such groups as the Samaritans, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Zealots. The Samaritans, also Jews, suffered a long history of hatred for each other, going back to the fall of Israel in 722 BC. But out of this background of hatred, Jesus identified a Samaritan as one who was truly a neighbor to a Jewish person in need. The Sadducees were the priestly aristocracy in Jerusalem, the leaders of the people. They walked a fine line between Jewish nationalism and keeping the peace with their Roman overlords. The Pharisees were a group of laymen dedicated to the keeping of the law, Torah. They had a saying, if all Israel would keep Torah perfectly for just one day, the Messiah would come. Some Pharisees opposed Jesus. Others befriended him, warning him of trouble, speaking for him at his trial, providing a place for his burial. The Zealots were the revolutionary underground. Jesus' disciple Simon the Zealot probably belonged to one of the first century groups who actively opposed Roman rule. The biblical literature. The biblical books relating the time of the Messiah are the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the Gospels. Although they tell us almost everything we know about the life and teachings of Jesus, they are not true biographies. Rather, they are theological documents telling who Jesus is and why he is important. They say little about Jesus' family background and youth and nothing about his physical appearance. They concentrate almost totally on Jesus' ministry, but even here they do not give enough information to reconstruct the history of those years with absolute certainty. Rather, they focus on Jesus' person and his teachings and give considerable attention to his death and then resurrection and surrounding events. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. The name Synoptic means that they view the life of Jesus from a common perspective. After introducing Jesus in different ways, depending on their purpose, they relate the ministry of John the Baptist, the baptism, the temptation of Jesus, his ministry in Galilee, his journey to Judea and ministry there, his final week in Jerusalem, his death, and his resurrection. The Gospel of John differs from the Synoptics in a number of ways. It tells us more about Jesus' early ministry in Judea. John also records long thematic discourses by Jesus instead of the usual shorter sayings of the Synoptics. More than the Synoptics, John includes theological reflection on the meaning of Jesus' life and death. The four Gospels together give us a more complete picture of Jesus than any one of them would by itself. Introductions to Jesus Christ. Each of the four Gospels uniquely introduces the story of Jesus Christ as marking a new beginning in God's dealings with his people. The Gospel of Mark uses a brief superscription and prophetic announcement to make it clear that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, a truth previously declared by the prophets. Matthew begins his gospel with a genealogy, showing his Jewish readers that Jesus is truly the Messiah by tracing his ancestors back to David. That Jesus' ancestry goes back also to Abraham evidences Jesus' fulfillment of God's promises to Israel. Two gospel writers, John and Luke, alert their readers concerning their purpose for writing a gospel. Luke provides a brief preface in which he sets out his intention. In a prologue, John begins with a clear statement about Jesus' preexistence and divinity. He wanted his readers to know and believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Transition, the prehistory of Jesus. The prologue of John's Gospel locates the beginning of the story of Jesus in timeless eternity. Before the dawn of creation, John at once identifies the Word as God the Son and distinguishes him from God the Father. Although there was a time when Jesus of Nazareth did not exist, there never was a time when the Word did not exist. Yet John announces a time when the Word became flesh. The Word became incarnate in this Jesus. This event, the incarnation, marks the time when the revealer of God became a specific human being. After the incarnation, John's Gospel never again refers to Jesus as the Word. Since the incarnation, God may be known in the person and work of Jesus. Now, the book of John, chapter 1, the eternal Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. John's witness, the true light. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. This man came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe. He was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. There was the true light which gives light to every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him. And the world did not know him. He came to his own, and his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the right to become children of God, to those who believe in his name, who were born not of blood, not of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. The Word becomes flesh. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness of him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, He who comes after me is preferred before me, for he was before me. And of his fullness we have all received, and grace for grace. For the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. The Word becomes flesh, John 1:14. John's Gospel describes Jesus' pre-existence by identifying him as the divine Word, or as expressed in the Greek language, the Logos. Many Greek philosophers spoke of the Logos as universal reason. People familiar with the Greek thought could have understood John to be proclaiming Jesus as the organizing principle or reason behind the universe. Some Jewish people adapted the Greek idea of Logos to fit the traditional Jewish idea of the Word. But more thought of the Word in traditionally Jewish categories. They identified God's creative Word with a divine wisdom, which they also identified with God's law, the Torah. They brought various ideas together, that God created all things through the law or wisdom, that the Word was life and light, and that wisdom had been with God from the beginning. In the prologue of his gospel, John declares something that neither the Greek philosophers nor the Jewish teachers conceived. The Word became flesh and dwelt among his people. To the Greeks, Logos was invisible reason, not part of the material world. To the Jewish teachers, wisdom was a divine attribute of Yahweh. But to John, the Word was the divine Christ who became a human being. The Word's glory was full of grace and truth, revealing to us the full character of God. Introduction and dedication. The author of the third gospel introduces his historical work, identifying his sources and purpose. Luke's gospel is dedicated to a distinguished patron, Theophilus, whose name in Greek means lover of God. Theophilus already had been instructed in Christian teachings, but Luke wished to provide him with certainty. Luke is alone among the gospel writers in beginning his account with a preface that explains in some detail his procedure and desire to write an orderly account. Early lives of John the Baptist and Jesus. Elizabeth and Mary, the mothers of John and Jesus, were either blood relatives or close kinswomen. The angel Gabriel appeared to both families, to Elizabeth's husband and to Mary herself, and announced their future sons, John and Jesus. Even before birth, these babies were named and set apart for unique missions. Practically nothing is known of John's boyhood, except that he grew and became strong in spirit. Only slightly more is known of Jesus' upbringing. Early in his life, Jesus was taken to Nazareth, a town of Galilee, and there raised by his mother Mary and her husband, Joseph, a carpenter by trade. Hence the child was known as Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus was his mother's firstborn child. He had 4 brothers, James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon, and an unspecified number of sisters. The only incident preserved from his first 30 years after his infancy was his trip to Jerusalem with Joseph and Mary when he was 12 years old. Occurring in the year that, as a Jewish boy, he attained the age of religious responsibility, the trip was at a crucial juncture of his development. Transition, the birth of John the Baptist. Luke gives an extraordinary glimpse of ordinary, pious Jews at the time. We should not imagine that everyone was as spiritually bankrupt as the Jewish leaders who later opposed Jesus. The lives of the barren old Elizabeth and the young virgin Mary intersect at the point of God's unexpected favor to his humble servants. Elizabeth was from the tribe of Levi and was also related to Mary. Because Elizabeth was barren and elderly, the birth of John the Baptist is presented by Luke as a special work of God. Luke implies that John was born 6 months before Jesus and that the two were relatives. Nor the gospel mentions their kinship, and John's gospel raises a question. If Jesus and John the Baptist were related, why did John not recognize Jesus at the time of his baptism? Some think that the Baptist knew Jesus, but did not recognize him as the Messiah. Geography allows for another possibility. Luke indicates that John was raised in the wilderness of Judea, whereas Jesus was raised in Nazareth of Galilee. During their early years, they were separated by quite a distance by ancient standards, possibly distant enough to be unfamiliar with each other as adults. Amen. This is the end of the Bible reading today. Thanks for joining me. God bless you. Have a good day. And see you tomorrow again. I'll resume from the book of Luke chapter 1 tomorrow.